Environmental racism is fundamentally the idea that communities of color face a greater burden of environmental harm than communities of white people. This means that they suffer more from pollution, suffer more from climate change, any kind of environmental harm. So there's this idea that cheap land is going to attract poor people and polluters, maybe corporations that are trying to save money. It turns out that race is actually a very strong predictor of environmental harm that communities might face. For example, a black family that has an annual income of $87,500 is more likely to face environmental harm than a white family making just $22,000 a year. So this shows that it isn't just an income issue, and it is actually a race issue. One critical characteristic of environmental racism here in this country is the practice of telling communities of color where they can and can't live. And because the foundations of this nation were unfortunately racist, that means that we often forced communities of color to overlap with environmentally dangerous areas. So this is places where we're mining dangerous things from the earth, like uranium, or where we're ejecting pollutants from industrial plants. Another really important form of environmental racism is environmental colonialism. So this is the idea, for example, that Americans would much rather farm their bananas that we all like to eat every day in Central and South America rather than do it here in our more tropical zones. Because it's cheaper to do so down there, and also because historically our government and the corporations that are supported by our government care less about the environmental impacts that they have on communities of color. Central and South America are predominantly composed of communities of color, not white people. And so it's easier, more convenient, and these corporations are able to escape the eye of mainstream media, for example, by practicing unsafe environmental practices elsewhere. So another legacy of colonialism and racism. So my answer to this question is heavily biased by the fact that I'm a conservation biologist. But I think the key here is nature and restoring nature. In urban environments especially, we have decimated the non-human natural world. And I say the non-human natural world because we humans are part of nature. But we've constructed these built environments at the exclusion of forests and prairies and rivers and all these things. What we've done is we've reduced the capacity of the land around us to literally soak up pollutants and to process them biologically, which means that we've removed the barriers between us and our bodies and things like pollutants. Let me make the case with climate change. So we know that climate change disproportionately affects communities of color. It also turns out that green spaces are very important for absorbing carbon dioxide and for reducing local temperatures. Green areas and parks are generally cooler than predominantly concrete areas. And so we can actually not only reduce the proximal effects of climate change on human health by supporting nature and building more green spaces and making sure that communities of color have access to nature in the same way that other communities do. But we can also address the root cause of climate change by pulling more carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis by supporting the creation and expansion of green spaces. Environmental racism and environmental issues broadly go far beyond pollution. And I'll argue that wildlife are most affected by the loss or damage to their habitats. And so when we expand our cities without including natural spaces, we are degrading habitat for wildlife, if not getting rid of it altogether. So of course, where there's less habitat, we can actually have just less wildlife. Now, where the habitat of wildlife overlap with humans, or they abut each other, pollution does indeed affect wildlife. So an example of this might be de-icing salts that are spread around on roads in New England to prevent roads from freezing over. This is important for humans because it keeps the roads from freezing, which keeps humans safer. However, what happens when it rains or when the snow melts is that the water becomes brine. It becomes salt water, which leaches into the habitats on the sides of the roads. So things like frogs and salamanders that might rely on ponds that fill up during winter rains or snow melt are now trying to breed in salt water, which is something that they're not adapted to and can actually cause developmental problems. Part of my research is actually studying how salt affects the development of salamanders, and it's not good. Without getting too specific, it actually just changes the entire developmental trajectory of the animal to the point that at certain concentrations where the salt is high enough, salamander eggs won't even hatch. There are lots of different ways. When we release chemicals into the water, those chemicals can actually be really dangerous for us. So there are a class of chemicals called endocrine disrupting chemicals, which might come from things like plastics or from fertilizers that we spray onto farmland. And if those end up in our water supply, as they often do, so this might, in the case of plastics, this might just be from like littering or a byproduct of industry. In the case of fertilizers, this might be because we spray fertilizers all over plant monocultures and then it rains. And when it rains, the water finds its way to lowlands and typically down into drainages and into rivers. And then it finds its way into our water supply. So this severely degrades the quality of the water, not just because we're adding these pollutants to it, but because of what these pollutants actually do to us and to wildlife, to nature in general, right? The system that we are a part of. So these endocrine disrupting chemicals can actually change our development as humans because our endocrine system relies on the release of things called hormones. But sometimes these pollutants can mimic hormones or can somehow block the hormones and then change these very, very essential processes within our body. So this is just one example of not just how water quality is affected by pollution, but also how poor water quality affects us and affects wildlife. But this is a rampant issue. Another example are the microplastics that are all throughout our oceans. These larger pieces of plastic become brittle and get broken apart and then circulate all through the ocean, which means that they're all riddled inside of the bodies of fish, many of those fish that we actually eat, which means that we have plastics all through our bodies too. So another example of how it's all connected, humans are a part of nature. What affects wildlife also affects us. What affects us often also affects wildlife. We've touched on this a lot already, and from my perspective, natural environments include cities because humans are part of nature. But essentially, a pollutant is something that wouldn't have been in an environment unless humans put it there, or wouldn't have been in the environment at that same concentration unless humans did something to put that pollutant there. And so this can cause all kinds of imbalance in many different ways. We talked about the endocrine disrupting chemicals. This can literally be like trash can fill up the burrows in which organisms live, and therefore they can't have access to their homes. It can be as simple as that, or it can be a biochemical process deep within bodies that changes the development of an individual organism, which therefore has a cascading effect over the broad natural environment, because what affects one individual is probably affecting many individuals, which then affects the things that are eaten by those individuals and the things that eat those individuals or rely on them in some other way. So it's all connected, and there are so many different kinds of pollution that can change any given natural environment. As I've probably said too many times now, humans are a part of nature. And specifically, we are a part of trophic networks. That is, the networks of things that eat and get eaten. So when pollution affects the populations of the animals that we eat, or the plants that we grow to eat, or the plants that we use for medicine, this affects us, this affects our health. And while you might be thinking, well, don't we farm a lot of those animals and we farm those plants? That's true, but pollution might affect the populations of the pollinators that pollinate all the plants that we eat. Or it might trigger an outgrowth of bacteria that affect the animals that we farm to eat. So it's really all connected. And it's all connected through ecology. It's all connected through what things eat and the relationships that organisms have with other organisms through symbioses. Fundamentally, when we alter natural communities, we are altering the communities into which our species is adapted, right? Homo sapiens sapiens emerged into a very particular group of natural communities, and we are seeing lots of change. We are causing lots of change in those communities. Fundamentally, our species will be able to adapt or it won't, which means that it's really in our best interest to keep things as much as they were as possible. What I mean by that is to keep communities, natural communities, which include humans, as biodiverse as possible. Because when we have greater biodiversity, we have greater strength in trophic interactions, we have greater resilience in symbioses and mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism, these fundamental interactions between organisms that let us live. When we pollute things, we change population levels, we change those interactions, and this negatively affects us. So bring nature back into urban communities, support nature in rural areas, and humans will reap the benefits.